Hello, I'm the Pink Phantom. Welcome to my podcast, where we will go deep into the lair of the purple worm instead of down into the rabbit hole, where we'll voyage into the astral realm of my mind and explore the verse of nerd culture. This is Phantom Thoughts. In this episode, I have a brief ramble about what the OSR is, or what OSR is. And then I get some calls from Jason of the Nerds RPG Variety Cast and Joe of the Hindsightless Podcast. Two podcasts that you should definitely check out. So let's get into it. So this is, I guess, what you would call a follow-on to OctoSR, and specifically the part where people talked about what the OSR meant to them. And a lot of the reason why it was kind of phrased that way is because, in all this time of OSR, people talking about OSR and OSR being put on the cover of products and things, no one can actually agree 100% what OSR means. Well, that's not quite correct, because the first two letters they can agree on. Old school. OS, old school. It's just the R where things kind of get interesting. And typically, it's revival or it's Renaissance, it's something along those lines. But, listening to people talk about it and looking at discussions about the OSR online, I've kind of broken it down into three words. First of all, rules. Old school rules. Even before there was the OSR moniker, there was an OSR movement of a sort, at least of a sort. Because people were concerned that with Wizards of the Coast coming out with 3rd edition, and with it being a departure in many ways from the older TSR era rules, that the rule sets would no longer be supported. And since the books were no longer being printed, because back then there weren't just PDFs available for people to buy of the older rule sets, that it would be hard to play and hard to make supplements and adventures for and distribute. And so this kind of led to the rise of the retro clones and other rule sets that were very close to the original rule sets because they needed to be compatible. This was all about compatibility with TSR level rules, whether it was AD&D or OD&D or BX. This is where the retro clones like Osric and Labyrinth Lord came to prominence. So it was about the rules, the rule sets, the old school rules, so that the gamers playing the older rule sets would continue to have new material to work with and could produce new material themselves. So now the second one, the Renaissance, was more about the style of play. It's more about taking rulings over rules and taking things that were considered part of the heart of the old school way of playing. Playing, not just playing what was on your character sheet. And a lot of folks consider inventory management part of that as well. And developing rules that more accommodated that style, but didn't necessarily immediately plug in to the TSR era rule sets. So if you had to adapt them, it may be a little more difficult, or it may be simply that some parts of the game that were in that rule set didn't exist. You might have rule sets that were strictly about dungeon crawls, kick in the door, beat up the monster, take their stuff. You might have rule sets that were more about exploration, hex crawls or point crawls. But it was about the style of play and kind of evolving that style of play into rule sets that might be easier for people to pick up, or it may be easier for people to just discuss and talk about and explain. The third word to me is revolution. This is where I think that whereas the first set, the rules group, they weren't using the term OSR necessarily until later, and then they realized, hey, we're OSR. the Renaissance was really more of the heart of the OSR term itself. I think the Revolution, there are people who are, well, the Revolution to me is taking the old style of play and the old style rules and looking at them with what can we learn from them and where can we go from here. It's not even necessarily saying we're going to play this style or we're going to play these rules, but what can we learn from them to enhance the way we play role-playing games? And this is where this group also, I think, departs in a lot of ways from the OSR moniker. They may use OSR as a marketing tool, and a lot of people pointed out during OctoSR that OSR has become more and more a marketing tool, saying, hey, if you like this style of play or if you like these rule sets, this is something you would be interested in. But it's more about that if they use it at all. And some folks, I think, on the Revolution end of the OSR are trying to get away from it entirely, whether it's because they don't want to be associated with that style or with that 3-letter phrase, or just because they don't like some of the people that they believe are in the OSR. But they still have some concepts that they draw from it. They draw from rules light. I think a lot of the rules light game sets fall into that category because partially that's rulings over rules, but partially it's something different because a lot of the older rule sets and sets that were based on them are not what you would call rules light, though they do leave room for interpretation. And it's more about that the style is so wide open that you can't have a rule for everything. And so the game master is going to have to make a ruling. And a lot of these folks fall into a DIY, do-it-yourself mindset. And you have the rules light mindset. And, I think from my perspective, I think that as he continued on with his career, Gary Gygax probably fell more into the final category, the revolution mindset, because if you look at the rule sets that he developed after and sold, after he was no longer working at TSR, yes, he was involved in Castles and Crusades, which is a very TSR-ish style rule set, but he also had 2 rule sets of his own, Legendary Adventures and Dangerous Journeys, which are very much departures from. You can see some similarities in there, but there's a lot of point buy in there. And some of the systems are more complex. Some of the systems are simpler. He was experimenting himself with what RPGs could be. So I think that is, the current status of the OSR as a whole. You have these divisions. You have the rules that are more focused on the TSR era rule sets. You have the Renaissance, where people are more trying to just emulate the style of those games. And you have the Revolution, where people are trying to essentially move beyond just the old rules and the old mindset and see what can they take that's based on the old, but it is new. So that's my last little bit, I guess, about the OSR. Just a random set of thoughts I wanted to put out there.
Hey, Pink Phantom, Jason here. Just listened to episode 2425. As far as 24 goes, we're talking about rules, not rules. I think one thing that gets missed, and maybe it's because the way things are written these days, and people aren't. I remember I read a lot of stuff from back then, especially magazines from, whether you're talking about sporting magazines, hunting magazines, different things. There's a lot of tongue in cheek writing. And a lot of Gary's writing in the DMG is tongue in cheek, right? Where he's talking about only use AD&D brand miniatures, right? You have to look at it with he's giving a little smile to the reader. A lot of this stuff he's having fun. He doesn't expect you to really do some of the things he says in the DMG. Now, a lot of it is serious DM advice, but a lot of it's tongue in cheek too, and that gets by a lot of people. I've had arguments on the internet with people over that, but you think about it, you go back and read like you know the different magazines of the day, and that was very common. So in addition to Gary kind of pulling the reader's leg and kind of winking at the reader when he's saying a few things, I I think we have to read it, some of that with that in mind. Now, as far as 25 goes, Joe talks about doing theater of the mind and then breaking out the maps and minis for combat. And I definitely get that. And definitely there are some games that are tactical enough you need it, like I said in my other call. My problem is a lot of times with VTTs and games I've been in, they want you to use, some DMs want you to use maps and minis for the entire game. So they don't have you doing maps and minis outside combat if you're at a table, but they have you doing maps and minis and you're moving space by space by space in the VTT, which is why I call VTTs virtual board games. And that frustrates the piss out of me. I got to tell you, I'm so sorry for saying that on your show. And I'll call you one last time for Daniel's calling railroads because I think it's important. I should go back and listen to what I said or probably called into you about railroads. But, Carl, the Gemologist Presents, recently said on a different show that, railroads only as railroady as the GM lets it be. And that's true. You could easily take one of these super linear adventures and if the players deviate, just go with that and just ignore the rest of the adventure if the GM's willing to do it, you know. But the important thing here is though, if the players have bought in, if you say, hey, we're playing the enemy within, or hey, we're gonna play, the we're gonna play this adventure, we're gonna play keep at the borderland, or we're gonna play Tomb of Horrors, then the players are on board to go through that adventure. And so that's not really a railroad. It's a railroad when they say, hey, I want to open the left door, and you say no, and you can't go left, right? You can't go in the forest. That's a railroad. Wow, sorry to leave you so many messages today. I just wanted, but I didn't get a chance in the other one to say thank you for your podcast. Thank you for your support of OSR October, your positivity, um, and your podcast in general. I really enjoy it, and I hope you keep it up. Really enjoy your thoughts on different things, and I'm looking forward to your next show. Take care of yourself.
Yo, Phantom, awesome episode. You packed a ton of information in such a short little episode. I can't imagine being that succinct. That's an amazing gift, dude. Yeah, I thought it was a really interesting take on why the AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide is written the way it is. Some folks say it's tongue-in-cheek, but I don't know, man. How do you tell? How do you tell which parts aren't and which parts are? None of us knew Gary personally. So, yeah, I don't know, man. But I really liked the perspective you brought to that. So great job, dude. Anyway, man, take it easy. Peace out.
Well, thank you both for the compliments. This podcast certainly has been a nice little adventure so far, and interested to see how it rolls out from here. I never know myself sometimes from week to week. But as far as Gary goes, I mean, I think a lot of the things you read that Gary has said in particularly the AD&D DM's guide, I think a lot of that can be attributed to, if you're in a hobby group and chances are you have a lot in common with the people in that hobby group, especially back in the 60s and 70s where you were, limited to basically your geographical area because long distance calls were extremely expensive and there was nothing like the internet. So your exposure to people outside of the area where you were raised, and therefore the people that were raised in the culture that you were yourself raised in, you wouldn't have a lot of exposure. So you would, when you adopted into a hobby and you found other hobby groups and you found that in a lot of ways they thought the same ways you do, and maybe a lot of it had to do with the hobby itself, whatever that hobby was. Maybe you just assume that everybody that's going to be interested in what you're doing is going to think the same way. And so it's like, if you have a group of friends, and they have inside jokes that make sense to them and are funny to them, but other folks may find, anywhere from baffling to offensive. And, that still happens to this day with the internet, where people just assume that people have the same way of thinking, the same track of mind. So I think a lot of it can be attributed to that. But again, I didn't know Gary, and I don't know anybody personally who knew Gary personally. So I can only go by what I read random people say in internet forums or read in books, or whatever kind of information you can have from people attributed to people who actually knew Gary and played games with him and things like that. But yeah, I do think some of it, to me, reads pretty tongue-in-cheek. But again, he could have been serious about some of it too that I don't know. And as far as railroads go, hey, railroads are, do you know you're on the track? Or is the track taking you somewhere you don't want to go? If the track's taking you where you want to go, you may not even notice you're on the railroad. This is the journey I've accepted. And I do think railroads, in terms of, a narrow focus, a linear plot, that's probably a better way to say it, a linear plot, get a bad rap. I mean, people who are just getting into role-playing games, especially if they get pressed into service as a game master, or they're trying to be a game master for the first time, having that linear process would make it easier than just having, here's a map and where do you want to go on this map? And that's, one of the reasons why I think the OSR products have lots of random generation in them, so that when your players do wander off the beaten path, or they do something that's not covered in the module that you're working out of, or the adventure that you had planned, you have some resources to work with to try to adapt to that, because that really is probably the hardest part of being a game master, is just, you got to be on your toes, you got to be on your feet, because you have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people, and their brains are going to go in a different direction than maybe your brain did when you designed an adventure, or go in a different direction than the brain of the person that designed the module that you're playing. But if it's a group that's established, that then it's something you can work through. And if it's a group of people that you just met on the internet, you have to give each other the benefit of the doubt. I mean, it's something new, and that's something new in this era, where people from all over the world just suddenly meet and start playing together. And it's not until you start playing that you know if your styles are going to mesh, and what your idea of an adventure is going to work together, even if you've had a discussion about it. The proof is in the doing. So thank you guys for calling in. And that's going to do it for another episode of Phantom Thoughts. If you have any feedback you'd like to leave, you can contact me by leaving a voice message at anchor.fm/the-pink-phantom, or you can send an email to thepinkphantom1@gmail.com, or you can contact me on Twitter @thepinkphantom. The music in this episode was Strength of the Titans and Late Night Radio by Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com, licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0 license from creativecommons.org/licenses/by/4.0.